Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 5, our second to last week of this class. I'm finally done moving, so new background. And what that means is that I will get any grades that I haven't gotten to yet in the next day or two. Because we're getting towards the end of the summer semester, it's getting to be time for you guys to send in your outlines. Um, there's a submission window on Canvas, but you can also just email them to me and I will get you comments by it depends when you get them to me because I'll grade them as they come in. But basically, like a couple days after you get it to me, you'll get comments back. So that should give you plenty of time to put any feedback into your continued work on them as you develop them for your final version, which will be due week 6. This class ends on the 31st of July. So as long as you get your final version to me by then, you will be in good standing. I can grant like some wiggle room with that, because grades aren't technically due for a few days after that. So if it's a few days late, same policy as always. I take late work, no questions asked. But after a few days, then the grades are like formally due in the system. And so at that point, we need to talk about like potentially incomplete or things like that, but those are really easy to handle. And so, yeah, if you have any questions about grading or the requirements for the course, just email me and I'll get back to you. Or you can come to my office hours, which are, as usual, Wednesday, 2 to 3, or by appointment. Anyway, getting into the content for today. There's a place on Canvas for your final paper outlines. We already talked about this. This is a wrap on Parable of the Sower, where we are going to talk about the last 2 chapters of this today. It's much more of a discussion-y book than it is a lecture-y book, especially because a lot of the themes that connect to history are things that we've already really sort of established context for. Like we talked a bit about script and company towns, which kind of connects back to when we talk about the future slavery that happens in the book, the things that Grayson and Emery experience and their kids experience. That's sort of what we were already talking about a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the Cold Wars and the violence of like basically like debt peonage, wage slavery, which is when you're technically paid a wage, but the wage is less than the rent you're charged by your landlord who you also work for, so you end up being enslaved, and then people's families get killed when they fight back, and that's kind of what we see happening here. Only we also see people being sold further into into enslavement and separated from their families. So, in that way, the enslavement that takes place in Parable of the Sower has more in common with chattel slavery during the Triangle Trade than late 1800s, early 1900s company town debt slavery, because we see this sort of like family separation aspect and this process of using people's pain to break them, which it's no coincidence that one of the last things mentioned, no, this is in the slides, this is just important context, I guess. It's very important that one of the last things mentioned on the second to last page of the novel is Frederick Douglass. Because one theme that sort of runs throughout the book it's not very often explicitly commented on. It's it comes through in bits and pieces, right? Like we get a lot of explicit commentary connecting slavery during the time of Parable of the Sower to enslavement during both the Company Town era, especially when we're talking about Olivar towards the beginning of the book. But once we hit the back of the book, when we're really talking more explicitly about enslavement and these formalized processes with slave drivers and overseers who abuse, who are paid to abuse um, black workers, and it's no coincidence that both Grayson and Tori are black Latina people, mixed race black people. Slavery is still racialized in this future world. We get a lot of commentary on enslavement from Bankole and from Lauren remembering things that her father said, drawing these parallels to 200 years ago to the period of enslavement and the ways in which enslavement operated with the sexual violence and brutality that enslavers would use to control people, as well as the lack of recourse people had to resisting that violence, uh, and then most significantly, the ways in which pain and family connections are used as tools to oppress and break people. So when we get to Frederick Douglass, if you haven't read any of Frederick Douglass, I highly recommend that you read his work, namely his autobiography. It's a very seminal work the field of in the field of, I guess, existence. It's not really an academic book per se. It's more of like one of those seminal texts of social analysis commentary. It's a memoir, it's an autobiography, so it's a full life story, not just it's an autobiography. Obviously that's in the title, but more to the point, it's a first-hand account of what it meant to live under enslavement. That's sort of the heyday of enslavement in the southern United States, and also what it took to escape enslavement. And Frederick Douglass kind of gives us a whole lens on some of what Butler's trying to do here with all of the commentary on the significance of reading and writing as a tool of liberation. Not only is Earthseed this tool of liberation because it's written and shared, but also like knowledge dissemination is where a lot of the survival skills that all the characters have come from. It's where their access to information comes from. Without it, they would have a difficulty navigating the maps, for instance. It's a tool for communication and understanding. And it's not a given. It's something that had to be hard fought for. And that's something that Frederick Douglass writes a lot about, is how he learned to read and write, why it was so important to him to learn to read and write, and like how he uses reading and writing as a means of escape and fighting back against a system that would continue to oppress him and sort of forcibly reduce him to a subhuman state, which, again, we've talked about this in previous weeks. And so it's very significant that Lauren makes this comment about Bancola at the end of the book, that he shook his shaggy head, his hair, beard, and serious expression, making him look more than a little like an old picture I used to have of Frederick Douglass. All caught up in this discussion of what it means to kind of work for building community and starting over when you've lost everything. Because one thing Frederick Douglass writes quite a lot about in his autobiography is that he had lost everything. He had no family from the beginning. His mother tried very hard to maintain connection with him, but it was common practice to sell people away from their families and deny them access to the basic information that we often take for granted about ourselves, like what day you were born, or who your parents are. And the other reason this is really significant for us is because another thing Douglass writes a lot about is the way in which physical brutality and emotional violence are used to break people and to deny them humanity. Like, not only is denying people access to information, both general reading and writing type information, knowledge, but also personal information, like when you were born, or your family, but also physical brutality through whippings, through beatings, um, the kinds of brutality that leads children like Doe and Tori to have this instinctual response to threats, to curl up protectively. As Lauren writes, this is not something that she's seen before because she has not. She has had enough privilege in her life to not be enslaved and to not be in situations where she sees the realities of enslavement until she ends up on the road building community with people who escaped that kind of brutality. Anyway, Douglas provides a really important lens for talking about this, and none of this is incidental. None of this is coincidence. It's Butler sort of animating the means by which enslavement operates, and also the reasons why sharing, and this is how this comes into our lecture slides for today, how sharing becomes sort of why it is such an exploitable, why it's seen as an exploitable trait, and a profitable trait, as disgusting as that is to say, but also like how sharing is, in addition to being a means for enslavers to control people, because it gives them access to more ways of harming somebody, it makes people more vulnerable. It also provides a way out from that exploitation, because at the same time as enslavement runs on using pain to control people, it also runs on denying people their humanity, and there is nothing more human than empathy. So, in a sense, the same trait that makes people very vulnerable to enslavement also makes people impossible, like also highlights the ways in which people are impossible to fully break, right? Like, nobody can have their humanity stripped from them. People can try, but we never lose our empathy, and our empathy gives us the capacity to love each other and the capacity to fight back. It's no coincidence that the escaped, formerly enslaved people that we meet in this book are parents who love their kids, who would die for their kids, and who show that time and time again, and also are, even when they are suspicious and touchy, like both Grayson and Emery are at first, empathetic people, not just because of their hyperempathy syndrome, but because they are willing to take risks and join this community, even when they don't want to. And it's not like they're best friends instantly, right? Like, Grayson doesn't actually like most of these characters, and nobody really likes him, but they fight for each other because they empathize, even if they don't like each other. Anyway, that's just important. Let's talk a bit about kind of an abrupt pivot, but let's talk about Earthseed and its prophetic contents, because the theme of futurity for this week is prophecy. So let's talk about Earthseed as a prophecy. Lauren frames Earthseed as a prophetic or visionary text for most of the novel. Right from the beginning, she's talking about Earthseed as having this destiny, and being this religious prophetic text that she gets access to in these visions. That she's not writing it, she's uncovering it, right? It's always there, and she's just sort of like channeling it, for lack of a better term. But we only really start to see this prophecy materialize in terms of the actions of characters outside of just Lauren herself towards the end of the book, right? When all of these characters come together and start building an actual community and putting down roots, and they found Acorn, right? This first Earthseed community, right? It's kind of theoretical and exists in Lauren's writing and desire before it ultimately materializes, and it takes quite a lot of the novel to get to that point. Most of the book, we see this prophecy in this concept that the destiny of Earthseed is to take root among the stars, right? And why does this destiny function as a prophecy? Or like, well, it functions as a prophecy because it's not just a diagnosis of the world that we're living in. It's also kind of outlining steps to take to survive Um, it's a warning that also includes a prescription, right? Um, it's not a prediction of the future. There's plenty of prediction from the beginning of the novel, right? Um, Reverend Olamina is not making prophecies, but he is predicting that Robledo is under attack, and rightly so. Um, Similarly, Lauren predicts that the violence is going to accelerate and people are going to die and that the neighborhood's going to be attacked, and it is. So, what makes this a prophecy? It's not predicting the future, it's analyzing the present and making a warning as well as a recommendation for action that could result in the thing that's being warned about not necessarily happening, right? So, like, what is Lauren prophesizing? That people will go the way of the dinosaurs unless they can escape the confines of Earth, right? She says that this is literal a lot of times throughout the novel, that if people want to survive, Earthseed needs to travel beyond Earth. It's the only way to avoid ashes and bones. I couldn't find which page this ashes and bones quote comes up, but it's somewhere towards the end of the novel where she's describing um, Earthseed to potential community members. Um, and this destiny is only accessible if people accept the inevitability of change, but also that they have a hand in how those changes materialize, right? Acknowledge the ways in which each of us is actively participating in, not just caught up in this complex, interconnected universe. She describes the universe in the epigraph to chapter 25 as God's self-portrait, and that each of the different pieces of this world, as well as the relationships that we all have, um, how seeds become trees, how rivers flow to the ocean, things like that, are all connected, and these interconnections are what makes up um, this picture of God as change, because all of these relationships are also founded on change, right? A seed only becomes a tree because it changes. Um, in other words, change is inevitable, but it's not immovable, right? Like a seed only becomes a tree if it gets planted, and it might get planted because a bird ate the fruit it was in and then pooped in a particular location, or it might get planted because a person plants it. But either way, it's not just that things are changing around living beings. Living beings are part of that change. And so she argues that this destiny to be a seed that takes root beyond the earth is only possible if people accept this role and try to work towards it. Um, and that's sort of the prescription here, right? And the warning is if we don't, we'll die. Like, we can embrace change and try to live in a changing world by being part of that change, or we can die. So that's why it's, that's the formulation here of the prophecy. And again, she says that she means this very literally, but at the same time, there's also an allegorical reading that we can make here, right? Like, Acorn is not Lauren's idea of an end goal for Earthseed. I don't think she would think that Earthseed even has an end goal, right? It's got a destiny of reaching the stars and fighting to access this like tangible form of heaven, but it's also change, so it's never supposed to end. Um, but that doesn't mean that Acorn isn't a step towards this prophecy, right? Um, Acorn is a community that only takes root because all of this found family comes together and chooses, instead of to ignore the ashes and bones surrounding them or to just try and survive amidst the rubble or destroy things and people in order to survive, right? They don't become killers or profiteers like Keith, and they don't just keep fighting to survive while things crumble around them. Like, a lot of the people who they run into along the way who join the community are trying their best to survive, but they're not trying to necessarily build anything. They're all trying to move north and look for something that already has been built. A place where there's more water, a place where things are more affordable. And what's interesting about Acorn and Acorn as this first Earthseed community is that it is a manifestation of this prophecy that people in this found family bring into being through their own desire to build and to plant instead of to just survive. This is a really important perspectival pivot, and it's the kind of perspective shift that Lauren has sort of been advocating for the entire time, right? Embracing change and choosing a future, choosing to fight for a future, choosing to believe in a future, and choosing to put down roots in the hopes of reaching that future. Um, so Lauren grows into her own as a preacher throughout the book, right? And she works very hard to convince people of the significance of Earthseed. Um, and the goal here is to get people to shift their perspectives in this way, right? To focus on the future. Um, And one way this happens is through like this ongoing metaphor of seeds. And another way is through the presence of increasing numbers of children amidst the community, right? The children are kind of the glue that brings the community together. And also the reason why a lot of people are fighting for the future in the first place is to make a better world for their kids. And so this brings us to another really important theme in the book, right? That the novel follows cycles. We start with Robledo, a community trying to prepare for violence that it kind of knows is coming. Some people know that violence is coming or suspect it. Some people are putting their heads in the sand, and a lot of people in Robledo have very different outlooks on how best to approach this, right? Like Corey has her ideas, Reverend Wilhelmina has his ideas, Keith has his ideas, Lauren has her ideas. Um, and so we start with Lauren trying to prepare. Then through Lauren's eyes, we watch Robledo get destroyed around her and watch her and her fellow survivors sort of try and fight their way out um, in the hopes of reaching someplace better. But where everyone else is kind of just like looking for work and trying to survive, Lauren is also trying to build towards men like realizing the destiny of Earthseed. Um, and ultimately, that's where the cyclical nature of this book comes in. Instead of just trying to survive, full stop, we sort of see these survivors building a new community together. And we end up in a place that's both similar to where we started, but also meaningfully distinct, which is a new community, one that isn't fixated on walls and keeping people out, but is instead trying to bring people in. Um, so cycle, but not just starting where we ended. Similarly, or not just ending where we started. Similarly, we start the novel in midsummer, which is when summer crops are starting to mature for harvest. And we end in late fall, which is a time of transition and preparation, right? Sowing new seeds for the winter crop. And that's literally, we see the characters talking about this, right? Lauren brought a lot of summer seeds along with her, but she also has a handful of winter seeds, and we see them discussing what they can plant and what more seeds they want to buy so that they can plant, in addition to harvesting the early winter crop of like carrots and sweet potatoes and things like that. And then, really significantly, everyone who joins Acorn has lost their first families. And they find a family in each other, or they build one, right? Um, Emery's Emery's sons were sold into enslavement. They were already enslaved and they were sold into a different enslavement far away from her. And she never sees them again. We still don't know if Curtis is dead. We can assume so. Everyone else in Lauren's family is dead. Bankola's family that we thought we were going to go meet. We get there and they burnt to death. Um, Harry's family is gone. Zara's family's gone. Everyone's family is gone except for the families that they make together and these handful of relationships that predate the group, right? Jill and Allie, and then Jill dies. We've got the couples who come together, namely Travis and Natividad, but their families from before are also gone. Anyway, they build a family together. They don't just they have a found family, but found family is kind of a misnomer because it's never just something you stumble into. It's something that people build and work for. Um, another couple important themes that we should just talk about a bit. Fire is such an important theme in this book. Um, and as somebody originally from Los Angeles, this is a hard one for me to talk about, just because my family actually left California because of the fires. And most people I know from back home were affected by the most recent crop of fires. A lot of people that I know, like their families had to had lost everything in the fire and had to start over basically. Um, and so it's kind of obvious that fire means death, right? It eats the landscape, it swallows people's families, it spreads through like literal violence, right? A lot of the fires that we see in this book are arson, and specifically, they are arsons set by people addicted to the drug pyro, which makes people want to start fires, and also is so addictive that people are said to willingly, be willing to kidnap and sell children into enslavement, specifically to fund their pyro addiction, which is what almost happens to Tori, and ultimately, like what gets Jill is killed protecting Tori from pyro addicts trying to sell her into enslavement. So fire is like it is violent and it is spread through violence. But at the same time, it brings people together who have nowhere else to go. Like, it's the reason they have nowhere else to go, but it also brings people together. It forces people to choose collaboration or death. And we see this play out very literally in the interspecies collaboration towards survival when everyone is running from this massive fire towards the end of the book. So on page 308, Butler writes, "There were dogs running along the road with us, but they paid no attention to us. Cats and deer ran past us, and a skunk scuttled by. It was live and let live. Neither humans nor animals were foolish enough to waste time attacking one another." Um, Interestingly, fire is has this kind of like double edge to it, right? Because it's also a massive source of change. It changes the landscape very literally, like a burn scar, which is what's left behind after a massive fire, always grows back differently. There's like nothing is ever forgotten when it comes to how fire affects landscapes. Just like how logging affects landscapes, right? Bancola talks about how like the reason some of the trees are so small um, on his land is because it was logged um, about like 30 years prior to the events of the novel, maybe 40 years prior to the events of the novel. Trees take a really long time to grow. And with burn scars, you're never going to get the exact same forest that you had before. Things are going to grow back differently. Different plants are going to grow back. This is actually one of the biggest, like, long-term dangers of wildfires when it comes to, like, out of control wildfires, when it comes to ecosystems, is that invasive species, like left unchecked, invasive species can often outcompete native ones in the aftermath of wildfires. We see this happening in California with the spread of like things like mustard, which grows really easily and can outcompete a lot of native plants. But also, a lot of seeds are strengthened by fire. There's a reason so many plants thrive around volcanoes. It's because volcanic ash is like very nutrient dense. And that's distinct from, say, a wildfire, but wildfire ash is also can also be like a nutrient dense growing medium. And a lot of seeds are sort of like triggered into action by fire. Some seeds are also triggered into action by cold because they evolved in places where there's a frost thaw cycle. And so, like, that triggers them to grow because seeds want to, like, grow at the time where it is most advantageous for them. So, some seeds literally are triggered by fire to start germinating. Um, and a lot of forests require some amount of fire to protect more destructive wildfires from happening in the long term. There's a very old concept in forest stewardship um, that comes out of indigenous forestry models called good fire, which is the idea that there's some fire that is good for the ecosystem, and that this kind of fire is like very necessary because it strengthens the growth of like plants that you want to grow. And if you burn away, say, dead brush and undergrowth, then you make the forest ultimately like more resilient in the face of, say, like a lightning strike on a very windy day, right? The reason wildfires spread so badly is because of particular like conditions where things are really dry due to drought, due to climate change, and very windy. So if a spark strikes, it spreads very quickly, and then the prevalence of underbrush, like very flammable kind of kindling, basically. It acts as kindling. And so when there's like good fire happening, then at the very least one of those risk factors is gone, the underbrush. And like all of the things that would be quickest to burn have already burnt away. It helps steward the forest safely and prevent wildfires from getting out of control and from becoming these like hundreds and hundreds of acre fires that we see today that cause so much destruction. Um, Now, this is like sometimes government forestry services have tried to do this kind of fire or to appropriate this tradition of like good fire into their forest management practices, but it's not done as effectively. In the context of like like U.S. Forest Services, this is called a controlled burn, and the idea is that Forest Service controls the burn, does this like preventatively, basically like a vaccine gets your immune system to like put up defenses to protect against like a catastrophic infection. It's the same principle. The issue is that indigenous peoples who've been using these practices in very specific ways that are like situationally dependent on the region that they're living in and developed over hundreds of years are very different from like a one size fits all government forest service policy. And this ultimately leads to controlled burns sometimes getting very horribly out of control. One of the most destructive wildfires of the last 5 years, or I guess 10 years, I think it happened in 2021, maybe 2022, was this massive fire in New Mexico that was caused by the Forest Service doing a very poorly maintained controlled burn, and it destroyed, I think, hundreds of acres of forest land. It got really out of control, and because the landscape there is so dry, it caused a lot of like instability in the soil, which led to the next time it rained, and this is another big danger of wildfires that get out of control. It led to massive flooding and like because burn scars, they're never the same. They're very prone to flooding. Anyway, fire is an important theme here because it's got this dual-edged sword energy, like Lauren's idea about change as being neither good nor bad, but everywhere, inescapable and powerful, and something that we have to engage with if we want to survive. Similarly, fire. And so the epigraph to chapter 23 is particularly significant for this reading of fire, right? Your teachers are all around you, all that you perceive, all that you experience, all that is given to you or taken from you. All that you love or hate, need or fear will teach you if you will learn. God is your first and your last teacher. God is your harshest teacher, subtle, demanding, learn or die. This is kind of the attitude out of which Lauren and her community build Acorn from the ashes and like out of the ashes and bones of everybody they've lost and every horror and hardship that they've experienced and that has been done to them. They look at the face of all of this violence and they not only choose to protect each other, but they try to learn from it so that they don't die. And then jumping back to sharing a bit, we read a lot here about sharing as a vulnerability. Right? It's valued by enslavers because it makes people easier to exploit. And it's like kind of gendered in a sense, right? Like Lauren feels that she has to portray a lack of, like more of a lack of empathy than is her instinct. even beyond sharing, based on the fact that she's trying to portray herself as a guy for most of the novel. Similarly, Grayson's touchiness and defensiveness, um, especially around the concept of sharing, kind of comes out of this idea that empathy is not a traditionally masculine trait, and he has a hard time with presenting himself as masculine and tough when he's also constantly in pain because he cannot help but feel the pain of others. So he comes off as like off and abrasive because he's trying to doubly mask, right? He's not just trying to mask his sharing as this vulnerability, but he's also trying to mask it extra so he can like meet this expectation that he has in his head about what it means to be a man. Um, so sharing is a vulnerability. It's also literally a vulnerability in the obvious ways that we've seen time and again, right? Like Lauren, Emery, Tori, Beau, and Grayson can feel other people's pain. When other people die, they feel like they die. When other people faint, they can faint. When other people feel excruciating pain, they cannot help but feel that excruciating pain. Um, so it's a vulnerability in terms of like fighting and surviving. But it's also a strength, right? It's very hard to separate Earthseed from Lauren's sharing. After all, her whole idea for Earthseed as a community is centered around the idea of sharing the burdens and joys of survival. Um, she's the only sharer that we ever meet who was never enslaved, and she's also the only one we've ever heard discuss sharing as a potential site of pleasure and not just pain. This comes from privilege, right? Um, but it's also significant because it shows that outside of extreme social violence, sharing is the kind of thing that has the capacity to be a site of joy creation and pleasure creation. And like, it's not just about pain, it is about empathy. And empathy is not only, we cannot only empathize with each other in the context of suffering, we can also, or we have the capacity at least, to empathize with each other's happiness as well. And she channels this empathy into Earthseed, right? It grows through empathy, the refusal to abandon others. Like, we read time and time again at the beginning of the novel that this rule number one of surviving on the road is not engaging with people. And yet, time and time again, Lauren and Zara and Harry adopt people. People who are in danger, people who might be a threat, people who, every time they come across new people, they sort of discuss suspicion and the possibility of ambush, especially when they go to like rescue Allie and Jill, and again when Tori and Emery appear in their camp at night. It's this idea that there's like a threat posed by every stranger, because there is, right? We've seen them get shot at. We've seen them lose people to violence. We've seen them have to fight off attackers again and again. They have watches every night. But at the same time, they often make this gamble, which is that deciding whether or not somebody that they come across seems like they are likely to attack or kill, or like they are unlikely to attack or kill. And if the latter, potentially putting out, an attempt to join a group and to like bring them into the fold of this community. And this is especially true with people with children. Most of the people that join the group have children with them, but not everybody. Um, right? Lauren and Allie don't have children, at least not with them initially. And same with Berkeley. He does not have, like, he's just that guy. Empathy allows them to reach out to these other people and take these first steps in terms of trying to protect new people, trying to feed people, and basically build these connections. And we see that this empathy only grows stronger and stronger, right? It amplifies as the people in this community deepen these connections fostered through the acts they take to care for each other. So, first, Jill is not even really capable of doing watch. Like, she doesn't put in the same amount of seriousness or commitment to it that other people do. And then when Lauren tries to talk to her about this, she feels like she's being attacked and she goes immediately into a defense or protective stance because she's expecting violence. She's expecting a beating from the life that she came from. But when she gets acceptance instead, she opens up. And then a few pages later, she ends up risking her life and ultimately losing her life to protect Tori without a moment's hesitation, in the hopes of basically saving Tori from additional suffering, from additional enslavement and violence, knowing the kind of future that would await Tori if she got kidnapped in this moment. And so she stakes her whole existence on this little girl's future. That's empathy. And so, along with pain and pleasure, much less often pleasure, but still, Lauren shares the destiny of Earthseed, the verses she's written down, and then also like literally knowledge and writing. And like she holds lessons, right? She doesn't just preach, she also holds lessons for the people in the group who never got the chance to read and write. And so these characters, they share their feelings, they share their grief, right? They bury all of their dead together. They share their grief, they share the things that make them human. And they share the tools of liberation, right? Because again, like we talked about, Frederick Douglass is a really important presence, even though he's only mentioned at the very end of the book. And the tools of liberation, according to Frederick Douglass, and very, very literally in history, are knowledge sharing, reading and writing, and empathy. Not in the sense that you can get your oppressors to empathize with you. It's not that simple. That's very romantic, and not how people get liberated, unfortunately. But in the ability to empathize with each other and build communities so that you can not just resist and fight back, but also build that future of liberation. And that's what we see them doing. If we had a whole semester to talk about this book, I would tell you about the history of Marinage, the communities that enslaved people would build as they escaped from enslavement and went off into the wilderness to start their own communities. There's a long history of these all over the Americas. A lot of them involve collaboration between indigenous people and escaped, formerly enslaved people who build sort of like multi-ethnic, multiracial communities together with their own complicated histories. And we see Black Seminole people are the descendants of maroon communities, Creole people in Louisiana, Lumbee community. There's a couple of examples of these. Anyway, that's kind of what Earthseed is in a lot of ways, or what Acorn is. Yeah, I mean, very literally, that's what Acorn is, because we've got escaped, formerly enslaved people building community in this remote location. Finally, we should talk about the funeral, both because it's what the book ends on and because it feels like a very significant moment of ending and beginning. So getting back to this theme of cyclicality, Earthseed collectively holds this funeral, right, to bury all of their dead, not just the people whose bones they found. And they use this moment of grief to strengthen not only the love they have for those they've lost, but for each other, right? So when Natividad gives Bancola the shawl that she made, in order to use it as like a shroud for his family, Lauren says it was the most beautiful thing she owned. Bencola says a thing like that should serve the living. Bencola said when she offered it, "You're living." Natividad said, "I like you. I wish I could have met your sister." So she's giving this shawl as a shroud to the dead to honor them, but also specifically to honor the living, to honor Bencola and the love and the cherishment that he holds for his family. It's an expression of her love for him, as well as his love for the dead. And since he loves them, then she loves them. It's a statement of empathy. And so is this choice to bury everyone all together, right? It's acknowledging that they've all lost their families. They've all lost so many people they care about, and they don't all have the privilege of being able to bury those dead. And similarly, this choice of oak trees and using a grove of oak trees as a way of honoring the dead rather than just headstones is pretty significant. It's a development, like it's an escalated, more powerful version of the burial that they gave to Jill on the road, right? Where they put stones over her to protect her from cannibals and dogs, but they also bury her under the trees. Because, as Lauren says, trees are better than stone, life commemorating life. Similarly, we see this with the action of planting acorns specifically, like you're not just burying the dead, you're also planting new life. You're not just putting them under trees like they did with Jill, but they're planting new trees. Similarly, they harvest this half burnt garden to survive while planting new seeds. Life begetting life, life commemorating life. And this sort of embodies Lauren's focus on Earthseed as a book of the living, not a book of the dead. It also brings to mind a really famous quote that you've probably heard some version of in various contexts, which is pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. This comes from Mother Jones, who was a union organizer from back in the heyday of what we talked about a couple weeks ago. The coal union, the heyday of coal union organizing in West Virginia with all of the union busting and all the battles that we talked about a couple weeks ago. So Mother Jones was a union leader, and she said, pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. And that sentiment has sort of echoed through the intervening decades. And still you hear it around a lot today. For more on her, she's an interesting figure. You can read about this festival that her birthplace, Cork, Ireland, because she was an immigrant, hosts in her honor. They have a festival for her every year. Anyway, that's the website for it. We'll talk about prophecies more in the next part. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or night while I attempt to open the thing so that I can pause this recording.